The scent of cold flint and dry, ancient dust hangs heavy in the midnight air of the Giza Plateau, a scent that has remained unchanged for thousands upon thousands of years. Under the vast velvet canopy of the Egyptian night, the stars seem to pulse with a slow, rhythmic light, casting long and silvered shadows across the limestone bedrock. The desert wind is a soft, persistent whisper, carrying with it the fine grains of the Sahara that brush against the stone with the sound of a long, drawn-out breath. In the center of this stillness sits a monument so massive and so silent that it seems to exist outside of time itself, the Great Sphinx. From this vantage point, in the deep blue of the twilight, the modern world feels like a distant and fading dream, and the stone beneath us feels like the only truth that remains. We often think of this place as the heart of the old kingdom of Egypt, a landscape defined by the Fourth Dynasty and the pharaohs who claimed this sand as their own. But as we sit here in the cooling quiet, we must wonder if the stone remembers a time far older than the kings of the Nile. The Great Sphinx is carved from a single outcropping of limestone, a colossal figure that rises out of a horseshoe-shaped enclosure, its body stretching nearly 240 feet across the ground. In the dark, the features of the face are softened, the damage of the ages blurred by the shadows, leaving only the suggestion of a gaze that looks eternally toward the eastern horizon. It is a gaze that waits for the sun, but it is also a gaze that has watched the stars shift their positions in the sky over 10,000 years of history. To run one's hand along the lower courses of the stone is to feel the deep, undulating grooves of erosion, vertical fissures that tell a story very different from the wind-blown sand of the desert. These marks are soft to the touch, rounded by the patient work of water, suggesting a climate long forgotten by the modern world, a time when the plateau was not a desert of amber sand, but a lush and rain-swept savanna. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day drift away, you are in the perfect place for a journey through the mysteries of our deep past. Here at the Slumber Archives, we explore these hidden corners of history every single day, bringing you new narrations to help you find rest while we ponder the secrets of the ancients. If you find comfort in these stories, perhaps you might consider subscribing so that we can meet here again tomorrow night. And a simple like on this video helps our quiet community grow, allowing others to find their way to this place of rest. Now, let us return to the silence of the plateau, where the shadows of the Sphinx grow long under the rising moon. To understand the mystery of this monument, we must look past the surface and into the very bones of the earth, into the science of stratigraphy, which is the study of rock layers and the way they are worn down by the elements. Mainstream archaeology tells us that the Sphinx was carved roughly 4,500 years ago during the reign of the Pharaoh Khafra. But there is a persistent whisper among those who study the stone itself, a whisper that points to the Younger Dryas, a period of dramatic climatic shifts that occurred roughly 12,800 years ago. This was a time of melting ice and torrential rains, a time when the world was transitioning out of the last great ice age. If the deep, vertical weathering on the body of the Sphinx was indeed caused by centuries of heavy rainfall, then we are looking at a monument that may have been standing long before the first Egyptian pharaoh ever wore a crown. The thought of such deep time is heavy. It is a weight that stretches our understanding of human civilization to its breaking point. We are taught that history began in Sumer and Egypt with the invention of writing and the organized labor of the Bronze Age, but the Sphinx sits there, carved from the living rock, suggesting a different narrative. A narrative of a lost civilization that understood the stars and the stone long before the records began. As the night deepens, the wind picks up, whistling through the fissures of the enclosure, sounding almost like a chorus of voices from a forgotten epoch. We must ask ourselves what kind of hands held the tools that first shaped this limestone, and what kind of mind looked at a natural outcropping of rock and saw a guardian for the ages. The face of the Sphinx is a mystery of its own, appearing far too small for the massive, leonine body it sits upon. Many researchers suggest that the head we see today is not the original, that it was recarved by a later pharaoh to resemble himself, perhaps thousands of years after the body had already been weathered by the rains. If this is true, then the original head may have been that of a great lion facing the rising sun on the spring equinox, marking a specific moment in the great year, a cycle of 26,000 years known as the precession of the equinoxes. In this light, the Sphinx becomes more than a statue. It becomes a monumental clock, a marker of deep time that was meant to endure long after the names of its creators were lost to the shifting sands. As the stars continue their slow rotation above the Giza Plateau, the silence of the Sphinx becomes a presence in itself. It is a silence that invites us to let go of our certainties, to accept that there are chapters of the human story that have been erased by the wind and the rain. We are merely visitors here, passing through a landscape that has seen the rise and fall of countless worlds. The limestone is cool now, the heat of the day fully dissipated, and the air is perfectly still. In this moment, there is no need for answers, only the quiet appreciation of the mystery, the feeling of being a small part of a very long and very beautiful story. The desert is a place of endless patience, and as the night carries us towards sleep, we can rest in the knowledge that the Sphinx will still be there when the sun finally breaks over the horizon, watching the world begin anew, just as it has for thousands of years. And perhaps for thousands more than we have ever dared to imagine. Long before the first stone was ever laid by human hands, long before the first word was whispered into the dry desert air, there was only the sound of water. Imagine, if you will, a world that looks nothing like the one we haunt today. A world where the golden sands of the Giza Plateau are not sands at all, but the dark, crushing depths of a vast and ancient sea. 50 million years ago, during the epoch we call the Eocene, the Earth was a much warmer, more humid place, and what we now know as the Sahara was submerged beneath the rolling waves of the Tethys Ocean. It is a strange thought to hold as you drift towards sleep, that the very ground beneath the Sphinx's paws was once a cradle for life that thrived in the cold, blue silence of the deep. As the eons stretched forward, a quiet and invisible process began, a slow, rhythmic falling of snow that was not made of ice but of life, tiny marine microorganisms, creatures so small they could rest on the tip of a needle, lived their brief lives in the sunlit upper reaches of the Tethys. When they died, their microscopic shells, composed of calcium carbonate, drifted downward through the water column, falling, 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 a gentle, endless rain of white dust that settled upon the ocean floor. This was the beginning of the Mokattam Formation, the very bedrock from which the Sphinx would one day be carved. Over millions of years, this layer of organic debris grew thicker and thicker, compressed by the unimaginable weight of the ocean above, until it hardened into the sedimentary limestone we see today. If you were to run your hand along the body of the Sphinx, you would be touching the remains of billions of these tiny creatures, a silent graveyard of the Eocene, frozen in stone. The rock itself is not uniform, it is a layered storybook of time. The lower levels, which form the base and the lower body of the monument, are composed of a softer, more brittle limestone, while the higher layers, including the neck and the head, are made of a much harder, more durable grade of stone. This natural stratification, this layering of the earth, occurred as the environment of the Tethys Ocean shifted over millions of years. sometimes calm and shallow, sometimes deep and turbulent, each change leaving a distinct signature in the sediment. And so, the very anatomy of the Sphinx was predetermined by the moods of a sea that vanished long before humanity ever dreamed of building monuments. As the great tectonic plates of the earth began their slow, grinding migration, the land began to rise. The Tethys Ocean, which had once stretched across the horizon, began a long and reluctant retreat, pulling back its blue skirts to reveal the raw, wet landscape of North Africa. As the waters receded, they left behind massive deposits of limestone and nummulites, fossilized shells shaped like tiny coins that still litter the Giza Plateau today. The sun began to bake the newly exposed earth, and the winds began their long work of sculpting the terrain. The Mokattam Formation was now a part of the dry world, a massive solid block of history waiting for a purpose. It is here that the mystery begins to deepen, for the limestone was not merely a flat plain, but a series of ridges and mounds shaped by the retreating waters and the initial pulses of erosion. Geologists tell us that the Sphinx was carved from a natural outcropping of rock, a Yardang or a wind-swept ridge that stood above the surrounding landscape. But we must wonder, what did that ridge look like before the first chisel touched it? Was it merely a shapeless hump of stone? Or did the natural forces of water and wind, acting over millions of years, begin to suggest a form? The way the softer layers of limestone erode faster than the harder ones can create strange, evocative shapes. Shapes that might have captured the imagination of a people who lived in a time we have forgotten. When we speak of the Sphinx, we often focus on the labor of the builders, the copper tools, the sweat, and the architectural genius of the old kingdom. But we must also consider the labor of the earth itself. The stratigraphy, that is, the study of these rock layers, tells a story of immense age. By the time the first pharaohs walked the banks of the Nile, the limestone of Giza was already 50 million years old. It had survived the birth of mountain ranges, the shifting of continents, and the rise and fall of countless species. It was an ancient, weathered veteran of the planet's history, long before the first dynastic Egyptian ever looked upon it. As you settle deeper into your pillows, consider the patience of the stone. It does not hurry. It does not worry about the passage of hours or days. It simply exists, holding within itself the memory of the ocean and the ghosts of the tiny beings that formed its substance. The Mokattam Formation is a bridge between the incredibly distant past of our planet and the slightly less distant past of our civilization. It is a reminder that everything we build is borrowed from the earth, and that the earth has its own ways of shaping what we leave behind. The transition from a seafloor to a desert plateau was not a sudden event. It was a process that took millions of years, a slow drying out of the world. As the climate shifted, the lush greenery that once followed the retreating ocean began to give way to the arid beauty of the Sahara. The limestone, once protected by the cradle of the sea, was now exposed to the elements. Rain fell, heavy, torrential rains that carved channels into the rock. Winds whipped across the open plains, carrying abrasive sands that polished the harder surfaces and ate away at the soft. This is the raw material that the ancients encountered, a landscape already etched with the signatures of time. We often assume that the story of the Sphinx begins with a plan, a blueprint, and a king's decree, but perhaps the story began much earlier, with a natural formation that already whispered of a monumental presence. Some researchers suggest that the head of the Sphinx, being made of that much harder limestone, may have stood as a natural monolith long before the body was ever excavated from the surrounding bedrock. Could it be that the earliest inhabitants of the valley saw something in that stone, a guardian, a spirit, or a symbol, and that their work was not one of creation, but of revelation? The idea that the Sphinx was found rather than simply made is a compelling one. It suggests a collaboration between the forces of geology and the vision of man. The Eocene sediments provided the canvas. The retreating Tethys Ocean provided the initial sketch, and the passage of millions of years provided the texture. By the time a civilization rose to power in the Nile Valley, the stage was already set. The limestone was waiting, heavy with the weight of 50 million years, silent, enduring, and ready to be transformed into the face of a god. As we drift closer to the edge of sleep, the boundaries between these vast stretches of time begin to blur. The sound of the ancient ocean seems to echo in the quiet of the room, a reminder that the world is always changing, always reforming itself in a slow, majestic dance. The Sphinx stands at the center of this dance, a monument of stone born in the sea, shaped by the air and reclaimed by the desert. It is a testament to the fact that even the most solid things have a beginning in the fluid and the fleeting, and that the story of our world is written in layers that we are only just beginning to read. The darkness of the night is like the darkness of those ancient waters, deep, peaceful, and full of the quiet potential of things yet to be discovered. Rest now, and let the weight of the ages carry you into a dreamless, ancient calm, knowing that the stone is there, watching, waiting, and remembering everything the world has ever been. Consider the sound of a grain of sand as it strikes a solid surface, a tiny, almost imperceptible click, repeated 1 billion times over 1 million years. It is a soft, rhythmic percussion that never truly ceases, a patient grinding that suggests that even the hardest stone is, in the eyes of eternity, as malleable as clay. Before the first chisel ever touched the limestone of the Giza Plateau, before the first dynastic king dreamed of a monument that would outlast his name, the wind was already at work. It moved across the open, desolate reaches of the North African landscape, carrying with it the abrasive remnants of older mountains, sculpting the earth into strange and haunting geometries. Long before the Sphinx possessed a face, it may have possessed a soul of wind and dust, a natural silhouette rising from the bedrock like a ghost, waiting to be summoned into the light of human consciousness. In the silent vocabulary of geology, there is a word for these wind-sculpted ridges. They are called yardangs. The term itself feels ancient and weathered, describing elongated landforms carved from the desert floor by the relentless, unidirectional force of the prevailing winds. If you were to walk through the white desert of Egypt today, you would see them everywhere. Strange white pillars and crested mounds that look like giant mushrooms or sleeping animals or the prows of sunken ships. They are the result of Aeolian erosion, a process where the wind acts as a master sculptor, stripping away the softer layers of rock and leaving behind the more resilient cores. As the centuries drift into millennia, these yardangs take on organic, almost intentional shapes, smoothed by the friction of the air until they resemble something that might have been breathed into existence rather than carved. Geologists who look upon the Great Sphinx see more than just a statue. They see a massive outcropping of limestone that was once part of the natural topography of the plateau. They see a landform that may have always had a leonine quality to it, even when the world was young and the Sahara was still a lush green savanna. The prevailing winds of this region blow with a steady ancient rhythm from the north and the northwest, and as they swept over the Giza Plateau, they encountered a particular rise in the limestone. Over vast stretches of deep time, these winds would have channeled through the natural fissures in the rock, widening them, smoothing the flanks, and tapering the back of the mound into a long sloping tail. It is a humbling thought to imagine that the basic proportions of the world's most famous monument were perhaps dictated by the breath of the planet itself, long before the first human hand reached out to claim it. Imagine the scene 10,000 years ago, or perhaps even further back into the misty reaches of the Pleistocene. The sun rises over a landscape that is not yet a desert, but a place of shifting shadows and limestone ridges. There, rising above the ground, is a natural Yardang, a massive, elongated hump of stone with a rounded protrusion at one end. To a wandering hunter-gatherer, or a member of a forgotten pre-dynastic culture, this shape would have been unmistakable. Even in its raw, natural state, it would have looked like a lion at rest, a guardian of the horizon, shaped by the gods of the air. This is the essence of the Yardang Theory, the idea that the Sphinx was not created from nothing, but was instead an enhanced natural feature. It suggests that the ancient Egyptians, or perhaps a civilization that preceded them by many thousands of years, looked upon this natural wonder and decided to finish what the wind had started. They saw the potential in the stone, the hidden figure waiting to be released, and they began the slow, sacred task of refining the wind-swept ridges into the precise anatomy of a kingly beast. This perspective shifts our understanding of the monument from one of pure construction to one of collaboration, a partnership between the forces of nature and the aspirations of humanity. The limestone of Giza is not uniform. It is composed of layers of varying hardness, from the soft yellow member at the base to the harder, more durable layers that form the head. The wind, in its infinite patience, would have naturally exploited these differences. It would have eaten away at the softer middle sections, creating the deep recesses of the body, while the harder capstone remained relatively intact, forming a natural mound where the head would eventually be carved. When we look at the Sphinx today, we see the scars of this ancient process. We see the horizontal bands of erosion that tell a story of different eras, different climates, and the constant, invisible touch of the atmosphere. As the years passed, and the wet, green Sahara began its long transition into the golden void we know today, the wind only grew more powerful. The sand became a more potent tool of abrasion, acting like a cosmic sandpaper that polished the limestone until it shone under the desert sun. It is possible that for thousands of years the Sphinx existed as a proto-monument, a landmark known to all the peoples of the Nile Valley, a sacred site defined not by walls or inscriptions, but by its sheer evocative presence. It stood there, a silent sentinel of the plateau, as the climate shifted and the stars slowly drifted in their celestial tracks. The Yardang Theory allows us to bridge the gap between the geological and the archaeological, suggesting that the history of the Sphinx is much longer and more complex than a single reign or a single dynasty. It invites us to consider the possibility that the site was already ancient when the pyramids were but a dream in the minds of the architects. The transition from a natural Yardang to a finished statue would have been a process of refinement rather than total creation. The early inhabitants of the region might have cleared away the surrounding sand and debris, exposing more of the natural form. They might have used simple stone tools to sharpen the edges of the paws or to define the curve of the back, and then, at some point lost to the records of history, a decision was made to carve the face, to give the wind-sculpted beast a human consciousness. This is where the mystery deepens, for the head of the Sphinx is notably out of proportion with its massive body. It is far too small, suggesting to many researchers that it was recarved multiple times, perhaps starting as the head of a lion or a jackal, before finally being shaped into the likeness of a pharaoh. If the body was a natural Yardang, its size was determined by the wind, but the head was the domain of man.
And in that disparity lies the echo of a much older story. We must wonder what it felt like to stand before such a thing in the deep past, to see a mountain that looked like a living creature, in a world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was thin. Such a landform would have been viewed with immense reverence. It would have been seen as a sign, a place where the earth itself spoke. The wind, which brings the rain and carries the scent of the coming seasons, had left its mark upon the stone, and in doing so it had created a temple without walls. As the light of the moon falls across the Giza Plateau tonight, illuminating the weathered flanks of the Sphinx, we can still see the work of those ancient winds. They are still there, whispering through the fissures, continuing their slow, invisible work, reminding us that nothing is ever truly finished. The stone remembers the touch of the gale. It remembers the time when it was part of a continuous seabed, and the time when it was a lonely ridge in a vast, green plain. The Yardang Theory does not diminish the achievement of the ancient builders, rather it elevates it, placing their work within the grand, sweeping narrative of the Earth's own evolution. It suggests that they were listeners as much as they were makers, responding to the shapes that the universe had already provided. Rest now, in the quiet knowledge that the world is always shaping itself, even in the stillness of the night. The wind that moves through the trees outside your window is the same wind that once carved the lion's back, a patient force that knows no hurry, a silent traveller through the vast and lonely corridors of time.
Imagine, if you will, the surface of a stone that has been left out in the open for thousands upon thousands of years. It is not a smooth surface, but one etched with the stories of the atmosphere, a ledger of every breeze and every drop of moisture that has ever touched its skin. In the early 1990s, a geologist named Robert Schoch stood within the hollowed-out enclosure of the Great Sphinx, looking not at the face of the monument, but at the walls that surround it. He saw something there that seemed to defy the accepted timeline of history, something written in the very texture of the limestone. While the desert is known for its abrasive winds and the stinging touch of sand, the marks Schoch observed were of a different character entirely. They were deep, undulating vertical fissures, rounded at the edges and flowing downward like frozen ripples in a pond. To an eye trained in the study of the earth's crust, these patterns do not speak of wind. Wind-driven sand is a horizontal sculptor. It acts like a cosmic sandpaper, scouring the softer layers of rock into sharp, protruding shelves and flat, hollowed-out recesses. It creates a landscape of jagged lines and horizontal grooves, much like the ones we see on the upper portions of the Sphinx body, where the desert gales have whistled for millennia. But the walls of the enclosure and the oldest parts of the monument itself tell a story of descent. These vertical undulations are the unmistakable signature of precipitation-induced runoff, the slow rhythmic work of heavy, cascading rainfall. It is the sound of water, not the howl of the wind, that echoes through these ancient grooves. As we dwell on this image, we must consider what it means for water to have carved such deep scars into the bedrock of the Giza Plateau. For water to leave such a mark, it requires more than a passing storm or a seasonal mist. It requires a climate of sustained, torrential rains, a period of history when the skies over Egypt were not the pale, cloudless blue we know today, but were instead heavy with the weight of grey clouds and the constant drumming of water against stone. This brings us to a quiet, perhaps unsettling realization. The Sahara has been a parched, hyper-arid desert for at least 5,000 years. The last time the plateau saw the kind of rainfall necessary to create these vertical fissures was at the end of the last ice age, during a transition known as the Neolithic subpluvial, a time when the savanna reached out across the sands and the rains fell with a frequency that seems impossible to the modern mind. Dr. Schoch's analysis suggests that the limestone was already deeply weathered by water long before the time of the pharaohs. If we follow the logic of the rain, we find ourselves drifting further back into the mists of deep time, perhaps as far back as 9,000 or even 10,000 years before our current era. This would place the carving of the Sphinx's original form in a period that mainstream archaeology often views as a time of simple hunter-gatherers, long before the rise of organized civilization or the mastery of monumental architecture. It suggests a ghost of a culture, a silent predecessor who looked upon the limestone outcropping and saw something worthy of eternal preservation. Think of the patience required for water to wear away at the earth. It is a soft force, yet it is the most persistent of all sculptors. Each vertical fissure is a memory of 1,000 storms, a record of a world that was green and wet, where the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, rather than the dry dust of the dunes. As you rest, imagine the sound of that rain, a steady, rhythmic pulse hitting the stone, flowing into the cracks, and slowly, over centuries, deepening the channels. It is a process that operates on a scale of time so vast that a single human life is but a heartbeat in its duration. The stone does not hurry, it simply receives the water, and in doing so, it preserves a climate that has long since vanished from the face of the earth. This geological evidence creates a tension with the archaeological record, a quiet mystery that sits in the heart of the desert. If the rain carved the enclosure, then the enclosure must have been there to catch it. We are left to wonder about the hands that first cleared the sand away, exposing the bedrock to the elements. Were they the same hands that we credit with the building of the pyramids, or were they members of a forgotten lineage, a people whose names have been washed away by the very rains that left their mark on the stone? The verticality of the weathering acts as a bridge, connecting the solid reality of the monument to a distant, watery past that defies our traditional understanding of how civilization began. In the stillness of the night, it is comforting to think that the earth holds onto its secrets in such a tangible way. The fissures are not just cracks in the rock, they are a form of natural stratigraphy, a word geologists use to describe the layering of history over time. By looking at the depth and the profile of these water-worn channels, we can begin to map the ancient weather patterns of a world we can only barely imagine. We see a landscape that was once vibrant and full of life, a place where the Great Sphinx stood as a silent witness to the changing of the seasons and the slow shifting of the stars. As the years passed and the climate began to dry, the rain slowed, and the wind took over the task of shaping the land. The sand began to crawl across the plateau, filling the enclosure and protecting the lower parts of the monument from further water damage, effectively sealing the evidence of the great rain beneath a golden blanket of dust. It is as if the desert itself conspired to keep the secret, hiding the vertical scars of the water until a modern eye could look upon them and recognize the signature of a lost age. The transition from a world of water to a world of sand was not sudden, but a slow fading breath of the planet, a gradual cooling and drying that transformed the cradle of civilization into a silent, sun-baked tomb. And so, we are left with the image of the Sphinx as the survivor of two different worlds. One world was wet and lush, characterized by the downward flow of life-giving water that etched its memory into the enclosure walls. The other world is the one we recognize, the world of the sun, the sand, and the horizontal scouring of the desert wind. The monument stands at the intersection of these two eras, a physical manifestation of the Earth's long and complex history. It reminds us that nothing is permanent, not even the climate of a continent, and that the very ground beneath us is constantly being rewritten by the forces of nature. As you drift closer to sleep, let the image of the falling rain wash over your mind. Picture the great stone lion sitting in the midst of a torrential downpour, the water cascading off its back and carving those deep, vertical paths into the surrounding rock. There is a profound peace in the antiquity of this process. The rain does not care for the politics of kings or the theories of scholars. It only follows the path of least resistance, moving downward, always downward, guided by the invisible hand of gravity. The fissures are the result of this simple, unhurried persistence, a testament to the power of the small and the repetitive over the course of thousands of years. The mystery of the vertical fissures invites us to broaden our perspective, to look beyond the few thousand years of recorded history and into the vast, silent stretches of the prehistoric past. It suggests that our ancestors may have been more capable, more observant, and more deeply connected to the rhythms of the earth than we often give them credit for. Or perhaps it suggests that the earth itself is the primary architect, and we are merely the latecomers who found a masterpiece already in progress and decided to add our own finishing touches to the face. Imagine, if you will, the scent of damp earth and the sound of wind rushing through high, golden grasses, where today there is only the parched silence of the sand. Long before the first stone of the Great Pyramid was levelled, before the concept of a pharaoh had even entered the human mind, the Giza Plateau was not a desert at all. It was a garden. This was the era of the Neolithic subpluvial, a window of time beginning roughly 14,000 years ago, when the monsoons shifted their tracks, marching northward to transform the African continent. The Sahara, which we envision as an endless, undulating sea of dunes, was then a vast savanna, a tapestry of deep lakes, rushing rivers, and lush woodlands, where elephants, giraffes, and hippos roamed across land that is now nothing but dust and heat. During this humid period, the plateau that would one day hold the Sphinx was a high green overlook, drenched by seasonal rains that fell with a rhythmic, tropical intensity. As the centuries drifted by, the sky would darken with heavy silver clouds, releasing torrents of water that cascaded over the limestone bedrock. This was a world of profound fertility, a time when the cradle of Egypt was not merely a narrow strip of green along the Nile, but a sprawling, vibrant wilderness that stretched as far as the eye could see. And it is here, in this forgotten emerald Sahara, that the mystery of the Sphinx's true age begins to deepen, hidden beneath the layers of time and the slow, steady work of the elements. The limestone of the Giza Plateau is a sedimentary rock formed millions of years ago at the bottom of a prehistoric sea, and it is uniquely sensitive to the touch of water. When we look at the enclosure walls surrounding the Sphinx today, we see deep, vertical fissures and undulating, rounded edges that look remarkably like the weathered cliffs of a river valley. To a geologist, these are the unmistakable fingerprints of precipitation-induced erosion, the kind of wear that occurs when water flows over a surface for thousands upon thousands of years. But for this specific type of weathering to take place, the climate would have to be radically different from the arid, bone-dry environment that has characterized Egypt for the last 5 millennia. As the years passed, the Neolithic subpluvial provided exactly those conditions, drenching the exposed limestone in a relentless cycle of wetting and drying. If the core body of the Sphinx was already carved, or perhaps if it was a natural limestone outcropping that had begun to take a suggestive shape, the rains of the Green Sahara would have acted like a slow, patient sculptor. Every storm would have carved the grooves a little deeper, every flood would have smoothed the jagged edges of the stone, creating a profile that looks far older than the dynastic era. This suggests a timeline that pushes the origins of the monument back into the deep mist of the 10th or 11th millennium before our era.
a time when mainstream history tells us that humanity was composed only of simple hunter-gatherers, yet a time when the earth itself was busy reshaping the landscape in ways we are only now beginning to understand. We must consider the sheer scale of the time involved here, the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the planet as it moves through its great climatic cycles. The transition from a lush savanna to a desert was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual withdrawal, a fading of the green that took thousands of years to complete. During the height of this wet phase, the Giza Plateau would have been a place of incredible abundance, perhaps even a sacred site for the prehistoric peoples who followed the migrations of the great herds. They would have looked upon the limestone mounds and seen something emerging from the earth, a form that spoke to them of power or protection. Meanwhile, the chemistry of the stone was changing. Rainwater, slightly acidic as it absorbs carbon dioxide from the air, would have seeped into the pores of the limestone, dissolving the calcium carbonate and weakening the structure of the rock from the inside out. This process, known as chemical weathering, creates a soft, almost melted appearance in the stone, a texture that is visibly present on the lower sections of the Sphinx's body and the walls of its pit.
It is a signature of age that is difficult to replicate through wind and sand alone, as sand abrasion tends to sharpen and scour, whereas water softens and rounds. As we contemplate this ancient watery world, we are forced to ask what remains of the cultures that lived through it. If the Sphinx was indeed a product of this era, it would have stood as a silent witness to the vanishing of the Green Sahara. It would have watched as the lakes retreated, as the forests thinned into scrubland, and as the people who once worshipped in the rain began to cluster more tightly around the life-giving waters of the Nile. The transition was a slow-motion transformation of the soul of the land, turning a paradise into a proving ground. The technical study of these layers, the stratigraphy of the enclosure, reveals a complex story of survival. Stratigraphy is the study of rock layers and how they are deposited over time, and at Giza, the layers tell of a monument that has been buried and unburied many times. But the deepest, most fundamental layers of the Sphinx show signs of having been exposed to heavy rainfall for a duration that simply does not fit within the established 4,500-year window of the Old Kingdom. To find enough rain to cause this level of degradation, we must look back much further, past the rise of the first kings, past the invention of writing, and into the heart of the Neolithic subpluvial. This brings us to a quiet, profound realization that the history we are taught in schools is perhaps only the final chapter of a much longer, more mysterious book. If the rain carved the Sphinx, then the monument is a relic of a world that no longer exists, a world where the Sahara was a place of shadows and cool breezes, and where the Giza Plateau was a verdant hill overlooking a sea of grass. We are looking at a ghost of the Green Sahara, a stone sentinel that has survived the death of its own ecosystem. And so, the mystery remains suspended in the air, like the dust that now settles on the Sphinx's back. Was it a natural formation that ancient people simply refined, or was it a deliberate construction by a lost civilization that understood the changing of the tides? The evidence of the water is there, etched into the very bones of the plateau, challenging us to look beyond the limits of our own short memories. As the sun sets and the desert air cools, we can almost hear the phantom sound of rain falling on the stone, a reminder that nothing is permanent, and that the earth is always dreaming of its next transformation, while we are merely the guests who arrived just as the rain began to stop. A single rhythmic scratching sound echoes across the valley, the sound of flint against limestone, a patient dialogue between human intent and the stubborn resistance of the earth. Long before the first Pharaoh claimed a throne, and centuries before the first mud bricks were laid for the tombs of Abydos, the Nile was not a corridor of empire, but a shifting green ribbon in a world that was still finding its shape. We often imagine the people of this era as simple wanderers, defined only by their struggle for survival, yet the shadows they left behind suggest a mind that was already reaching for the stars. These were the pre-dynastic cultures, the silent ancestors who walked the Giza Plateau when the Sahara was not a sea of sand, but a mosaic of savanna and seasonal lakes. They watched the same horizons we see today, but through eyes that understood the language of the wind and the migration of the herds. They were observers of the infinite, and it is here, in the deep strata of the unspoken past, that the story of the Sphinx may truly begin. As the centuries drifted by, these hunter-gatherers began to settle into the rhythm of the land, developing a sophistication that defies the traditional labels we place upon them. We see the glint of their presence in the way they shaped their tools and the care with which they buried their dead. But most strikingly, we see it in their relationship with the sky. Far to the south of Giza, in the desolate basin known as Nabta Playa, lies a testament to this early brilliance. There, standing in the dust, is a small circle of stones, a calendar of rock that predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. It is a humble structure at first glance, yet its alignment is precise, tracking the summer solstice and the arrival of the monsoon rains with a mathematical grace. Through the lens of archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient people understood the heavens, we realize that these early inhabitants were not merely reacting to their environment. They were measuring it. They were seeking the underlying order of the universe, mapping the stars of Orion and the path of the sun with a dedication that suggests a deeply spiritual connection to the cosmos. If a culture thousands of years before the pyramids could calculate the movements of the celestial sphere, we must ask ourselves what they saw when they looked at the limestone outcrops of the north. The Giza Plateau was not always a construction site. It was once a natural landscape of ridges and depressions shaped by the retreating oceans of the Eocene epoch. Among these formations was a particular mound of rock, a yardang sculpted by the wind, and the occasional torrents of rain into a shape that vaguely resembled a reclining beast. To a modern eye, it might have looked like nothing more than a hill, but to a mind steeped in the symbolism of the natural world, it may have been a sign. There is a growing whispers among those who study the deep past that the Sphinx was not created from nothing, but was instead recognized. Perhaps these early people saw a lion's back in the curve of the stone, or a guardian's head in the way the light hit the ridge at dawn. This theory of recognition suggests that the first marks made upon the Sphinx were not the work of a state-sponsored labor force, but the devotional carvings of a much older society. Using basic stone tools, they might have refined what nature had already begun, smoothing a flank or sharpening the line of a shoulder. In the quiet of the pre-dynastic evening, the plateau would have felt like a sacred space, a bridge between the fertile valley and the high, dry desert where the gods were thought to reside. The stone itself, weathered by thousands of years of exposure, would have already possessed a sense of ancient authority. As these early people moved through the landscape, they were not just looking for food or shelter. They were looking for meaning, and in the silhouette of the Sphinx, they may have found a focal point for their emerging cosmology. Meanwhile, the climate continued its slow, inexorable shift. The Green Sahara began to retreat, the lakes dried into salt pans, and the people were pushed closer to the life-giving waters of the Nile. This transition, which occurred over several millennia, created a pressure cooker of cultural development. As different groups converged on the river, their ideas mingled, and their astronomical knowledge became more refined. They brought with them the memory of the stone circles and the sacred mounds, carrying the seeds of what would eventually become the Egyptian civilization. But the Sphinx remained where it had always been, a silent witness to this migration. If it had already been partially shaped by these earlier hands, it would have stood as a relic of a forgotten age even to the people who would eventually build the pyramids. It would have been a monument of the first time, the Zep Tepi, a legendary era when the gods walked the earth and the foundations of the world were laid. Archaeology often relies on stratigraphy, the study of layers of earth, to tell a story. But the Sphinx sits in a pit where the layers have been cleared away, leaving us with a chronological vacuum. We are forced to look at the stone itself, which tells a story of extreme age. The vertical fissures and the rounded, undulating wear patterns on the body of the monument suggest a long period of exposure to heavy rainfall, a climate that had largely vanished from Egypt by the 4th millennium before the Common Era. If we accept the evidence of the water, we are forced to accept that the Sphinx, or at least the original core of it, was present during that wetter epoch. It was there when the lions still roamed the savannas, and when the people of Nabta Playa were first learning to read the stars. It was a bridge across the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climatic cooling and upheaval, serving as a constant in a world that was being violently reshaped. And so, we must consider the possibility that the Great Sphinx is a palimpsest, a document that has been written over, erased, and rewritten many times. The face we see today, with its regal features and royal headdress, may be the final layer of a much older story. Beneath that face, within the very heart of the limestone, lies the ghost of a different guardian. Perhaps it was a lion, or perhaps something even more primal, a creature born from the imagination of a culture that saw no divide between the earth and the sky. These pre-dynastic shadows remind us that history does not always move in a straight line. It circles back, it pauses, and it builds upon the ruins of what came before. The hunter-gatherers of the Nile Valley were not the primitive precursors to greatness. They were the architects of the foundational myths that would sustain Egypt for 3,000 years. As the wind whispers across the plateau, carrying the fine dust of the desert, it's easy to feel the weight of these forgotten ages. We are standing on the shoulders of giants who did not leave their names, only their questions etched into the rock. They understood that the stone is a vessel for memory, a way to speak to a future they could never fully imagine. The Sphinx, in its quiet majesty, remains the ultimate vessel. It sits at the intersection of geology and human longing, a monument that was perhaps carved not by a single king, but by the collective hand of humanity as we slowly woke up to the wonder of the world around us. In the stillness of the night, the plateau feels less like a graveyard of kings and more like a library of stone, where every crack and every weathered curve is a page waiting to be read, if only we can learn to see through the eyes of those who came before the dawn. If you were to stand at the base of the Sphinx in the silver light of a full moon, you might notice something that feels slightly unsettled. It is a subtle disharmony that the eye often overlooks because we have been trained by thousands of postcards and history books to see the monument as a finished, cohesive whole. But as the shadows stretch across the limestone floor, a strange truth reveals itself in the geometry of the stone. The head of the Great Sphinx is notably, almost inexplicably, small in proportion to its massive, elongated body. While the paws stretch out like great ships and the haunches rise like mountains of sediment, the face of the pharaoh sits atop the neck with a curious daintiness, as if it were a delicate mask placed upon the shoulders of a giant. In the world of classical sculpture, symmetry and proportion were the silent languages of power. The ancient Egyptians were masters of scale, capable of carving colossi that remained perfectly balanced, even when they reached heights of 60 feet. And yet, here at Giza, we see a creature whose head seems to belong to a different entity entirely. This observation has led many to look past the serene gaze of the pharaoh and ask whether we are looking at a finished work or a desperate revision. There is a growing hypothesis among those who study the deep patterns of the stone that the face we see today was not the original face of the monument. Instead, they suggest that what we are witnessing is a monumental act of recycling, a recarving of a much older, much larger head that had perhaps stood for thousands of years before the first dynasty of Egypt ever drew breath. As the wind whispers through the hollows of the plateau, one begins to imagine the Sphinx as it might have looked in a truly distant epoch. If the head were originally carved to match the scale of the body, it would have been a towering feature, perhaps rising twice as high as the current crown. But stone, even the hardest limestone, is not immune to the slow, grinding teeth of time. If the Sphinx had indeed been carved during the moist, rainy periods of the late Pleistocene, thousands of years before the rise of the pharaohs, the original head would have been the most exposed part of the structure. It would have taken the brunt of the wind, the rare but torrential rains, and the scouring desert sands. By the time the Old Kingdom Egyptians arrived on the scene, that original head might have been nothing more than a weathered, featureless nub of rock, a silent ruin protruding from the sand. And so, we must wonder what form that original head took. If it was not the face of a king, what guardian watched over the plateau when the Sahara was still a lush savanna? Many geologists and independent researchers point to the anatomy of the body itself for a clue. The long, flat back and the heavy, powerful chest are the unmistakable characteristics of a feline. This leads to the haunting possibility that the Sphinx was once a complete lion, a colossal beast of the stars, perhaps carved to mirror the constellation of Leo as it rose above the horizon on the spring equinox many millennia ago. In this version of history, the pharaohs did not build the Sphinx, they inherited it. Finding a weathered, leonine ruin, they may have seen it as their sacred duty to restore the monument, carving the battered head into the likeness of their ruler, Khafra or Khufu, even if it meant sacrificing the original scale to reach the fresh, unweathered stone hidden deep within the neck. Meanwhile, others look to the ancient gods of the underworld for an answer. There is a compelling theory that the original figure was not a lion, but a jackal, the sitting form of Anubis, the guardian of the secret places. Anubis is traditionally depicted with a straight, flat back and a long, bushy tail tucked beside his haunch, a posture that matches the Sphinx almost perfectly. If the monument were originally Anubis, the high, pointed ears of the jackal would have been the first things to erode and break away, leaving behind a blocky mass of stone that a later king could easily reshape into a human head adorned with the royal Nem's headdress. This would explain why the head is so small. It was the only way to find a solid, rectangular core of rock within the tapering, eroded neck of the original animal. As we contemplate these possibilities, the weight of deep time becomes almost tangible. We are forced to consider a timeline where the history we are taught in school is merely the final chapter of a much longer, more mysterious story. If the head was recarved, then the Sphinx is not a monument to a single man's ego, but a palimpsest, a piece of parchment that has been scraped clean and written upon again and again. It is a bridge between the world we know and a Zep Tepi, or first time, that the Egyptians themselves spoke of with great reverence. The technical term for this layering of history is stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and their chronological sequence. Usually we use this to date the earth itself, but here the Sphinx acts as a piece of living stratigraphy. The body shows the deep, rolling scars of water erosion, suggesting a time of heavy rainfall, while the head shows only the sharp, crisp marks of copper chisels and wind-blown sand. The discrepancy is jarring once you learn to see it. It is as if the head and the body belong to two different worlds, separated by a gulf of 5,000 years or more. In the stillness of the Giza night, the idea of the recarved head offers a strange kind of comfort. It suggests that the ancients were just like us, seekers who looked upon the ruins of an even older past and tried to find their own place within it. They saw something magnificent and half-forgotten emerging from the sand, and they reached out to touch it, to claim it, and to preserve it in their own image. As the stars wheel slowly overhead, the Sphinx remains a silent witness to this cycle of forgetting and remembering. Whether it was once a lion, a jackal, or a god whose name has been lost to the winds, it continues to sit in its limestone pit, guarding the secrets of an age that existed long before the first word was ever written in stone. The disproportion of its form is not a mistake of the craftsman. It is a scar of survival. It is the evidence of a monument that has lived through cataclysms we can barely imagine, losing its original identity so that it might endure into our present day. And as we drift further into the quiet of the night, we might realize that the mystery of the face is not in who it represents, but in what it hides. The ghost of a much older guardian, still sleeping beneath the features of the king. Consider for a moment the precision of a shadow as it stretches across the cooling sand, a dark finger of time that knows exactly where to point when the world finds its balance. In the quiet moments of the year, when day and night are of equal length, the Great Sphinx performs a ritual that has remained unchanged for thousands of years. As the sun begins its ascent over the eastern horizon, on the vernal equinox, it does not merely rise. It greets the Sphinx directly in its gaze. The monument sits perfectly aligned to the cardinal east, staring toward the dawn with an unwavering focus that suggests its position was never a matter of convenience, but a calculated tethering of the earth to the heavens. This alignment is the foundation of a field known as archaeoastronomy, the study of how ancient people understood the sky, and it offers a silent golden thread that leads us back through the labyrinth of history, far beyond the dynasties of the pharaohs. To understand the weight of this alignment, we must look at the sky not as it appears tonight, but as it shifted through the vast cycles of the great year. Because of a slow wobble in the Earth's axis known as axial precession, the stars behind the rising sun on the equinox change over vast stretches of time. Every 2,160 years, a new constellation takes its place as the backdrop for the dawn, marking a slow celestial clock that completes a full circle every 26,000 years. When the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom walked the Giza Plateau, the sun rose in the constellation of Taurus, the bull, and yet there is a curious dissonance in the symbolism. If the Sphinx were built solely as a monument to a Fourth Dynasty king, one might expect it to reflect the iconography of the bull, but instead we find the lion. This discrepancy has led some to look further back into the deep well of the past, searching for a time when the earth and the sky were in perfect, symbolic harmony. They find this moment in the middle of the 11th millennium before our era, specifically around the year 10,500 BCE. This era is often referred to by researchers as the Age of Leo. In this distant epoch, as the sun broke the horizon on the morning of the spring equinox, it would have risen directly into the heart of the constellation Leo. At that precise moment in history, a person standing before the monument would have seen a terrestrial lion of stone gazing directly at its own celestial reflection in the stars. The theory suggests that the Giza Plateau was designed as a massive terrestrial map of the sky, a mirror of the heavens frozen in limestone, while the three great pyramids are often said to align with the belt of Orion. The Sphinx serves as the anchor for the entire complex, marking the vernal point with feline grace. Imagine the world as it existed 12,000 years ago. The ice sheets of the north were beginning their long, tumultuous retreat during the period known as the Younger Dryas, a time of sudden cooling and catastrophic flooding that reshaped the face of the globe. It was a time of transition, a bridge between the end of the last ice age and the beginning of the world we recognize today. If the Sphinx was carved then, it was not a product of the desert we know, but of a greener, more fertile Africa, a place where the rain still fell and the lion was the undisputed master of the savannah. The concept of the Giza monuments as a map of the stars from 10,500 BCE is a haunting one, for it implies a level of sophisticated planning and astronomical knowledge that predates the invention of writing or the wheel by thousands of years. It suggests that a culture possessed of a profound patience watched the stars for centuries, tracking the slow drift of the constellations until they understood the clockwork of the cosmos. They did not build for their own lifetimes, perhaps, but for the ages, creating a marker that would survive the rising tides and the shifting sands, waiting for a future generation to look up at the stars and realize the connection. As we lie here in the stillness, it is easy to feel the gravity of such a span of time. 10,000 years is a distance almost too great for the human mind to bridge. It is a span that sees the rise and fall of countless languages, the birth of agriculture, and the slow transformation of the very climate itself. Yet the stone remains. The proponents of this older date point to the weathering on the Sphinx's body, those deep, undulating fissures caused by centuries of heavy rainfall, and note that such weather patterns have not existed on the Giza Plateau since the end of the last ice age. The geology and the astronomy seem to whisper the same date, pointing toward a forgotten chapter of human history that mainstream archaeology, with its focus on carbon dating and pottery shards, is often hesitant to read. Mainstream scholars argue that the alignment could be coincidental, or that the Egyptians were simply looking back at a sacred first time, a legendary golden age they called Zep-Tepi. They suggest the monuments were built 4,500 years ago to commemorate this ancient era, using advanced calculations to predate their own work. But the physical evidence of the stone tells a more visceral story. It speaks of a monument that has been repaired, recarved, and reclaimed by different cultures over a period of time so vast it makes the Roman Empire seem like a recent memory. If the Sphinx was indeed a lion carved at the dawn of the age of Leo, it would mean that the face we see today, the calm, human face of a pharaoh, is merely a mask. It is a later addition, a renaming of an ancient god. The original head would have been that of a great cat, proportional to the massive body, towering over the plateau as a guardian of the eastern gate. This would explain the strange disproportion we find today, the way the head seems too small for the sprawling haunches. The head was not built small, it was carved down, reduced from a weathered lion's mane into the features of a king, long after the original builders had vanished into the mists of prehistory. The stars continue their slow, rhythmic dance above us, oblivious to the debates of men. But for those who study the light of the past, the Sphinx remains a silent witness to a cosmic order. It is a bridge between the earth and the sky, a limestone anchor that holds the memory of a time when the sun rose in the sign of the lion. As the night deepens and the air grows still, we might find ourselves wondering what other secrets are written in the stars, and what other monuments might be hiding in plain sight, waiting for the sky to shift once more and reveal their true purpose. The Giza Plateau is not just a cemetery of kings, but a clock of the world, and the Sphinx is the hand that points toward a beginning we are only just starting to remember. The lion watches the horizon, waiting for the cycle to complete, while we, in our brief moment of time, try to decipher the language of the stones. And as the weights of the ages press down, we drift further into the quiet, sensing that the true history of our world is much older and much more mysterious than we ever dared to dream. The sound of a heavy footfall on the limestone floor of the Giza Plateau carries a peculiar weight, a dull resonance that hints at a world not of solid stone, but of hidden hollows. Beneath the paws of the Great Sphinx, the earth holds its breath, concealing secrets that the wind and the sand have long forgotten. While the surface of the monument tells a story of erosion and the passage of dynasties, there is a different narrative unfolding beneath the bedrock, one that speaks in the language of echoes and vibrations. For decades, researchers have felt a strange pull toward the ground, a sense that the true legacy of this site is not what stands against the sky, but what lies buried in the dark, cool silence of the earth. As we look closer at the limestone beneath the monument, we find that the stone itself acts as a veil. In the late 20th century, specifically during the years of 1987 and 1991, teams of scientists arrived not with shovels or brushes, but with sophisticated sensors designed to peer through the solid rock. Using seismic refraction and ground-penetrating radar, these researchers sent pulses of energy deep into the plateau, waiting for the return signal to tell them what lay below. What they found was not the uniform density of a natural geological formation. Instead, the data revealed a series of anomalies, distinct rectangular voids located deep beneath the front paws and along the flanks of the Sphinx. These were not the jagged, irregular cracks of nature, but appeared to be cavities with deliberate, geometric shapes, resting some 20 feet below the surface. The implications of these findings ripple through our understanding of the site like a stone dropped into a still pond. To find hollow chambers beneath a monument that may already predate the pharaohs suggests a level of subterranean engineering that defies simple explanation. These are not merely burial shafts or the haphazard tunnels of tomb robbers, but seem to be integral parts of a larger, hidden design. Scientists have been careful in their descriptions, calling them anomalies to remain within the bounds of objective observation, yet the precision of the readings suggests something far more intentional. It is as if the Sphinx is not just a statue, but a lid, a massive, lion-headed seal placed over a library of the deep past. This brings us to the whispers of the Hall of Records, a concept that has haunted the dreams of seekers and historians for generations. Long before modern radar confirmed the existence of these voids, esoteric traditions and ancient accounts spoke of a hidden repository of knowledge buried beneath the lion's feet. It is said that this chamber contains the collective wisdom of a lost age, perhaps the records of that very civilization that carved the Sphinx when the stars of Leo first rose with the sun. The idea of a prehistoric archive, a place where the history of a forgotten world was preserved in stone or metal to survive a global catastrophe, carries a profound weight. It suggests that we are not the first to reach a peak of understanding, and that our ancestors were concerned with how their story would be told to those who followed in the distant, misty future. The search for this hall has always been a delicate dance between curiosity and preservation. To map the interior of the plateau without damaging the structure is a feat of modern technological grace. We use stratigraphy, the study of rock layers, to understand the age of the ground, and we use non-invasive tools to ensure that the sanctity of the site remains undisturbed. There is a deep, almost spiritual patience required for this work. We cannot simply tear into the earth to satisfy our longing for answers. We must wait for the technology to catch up to our questions. And so, the scientists move slowly, dragging their sensors across the sun-drenched stone, listening to the way the sound changes when it passes over a void, feeling the shadow of something vast and empty beneath their feet. Meanwhile, the myths of the ancient world seem to align with these modern discoveries in ways that feel almost uncanny. In the writings of the Hermetic tradition and the whispers of the early chroniclers, there are mentions of a sacred chamber that holds the secrets of the gods. If the Sphinx truly dates back to the end of the last ice age, to the period known as the Younger Dryas, a time of sudden cooling and catastrophic flooding nearly 12,000 years ago, then a subterranean chamber would have been the only safe place to store the remnants of a culture. While the surface of the world was being reshaped by fire and water, the silence of the underground would have remained pristine. The voids detected by the seismic surveys sit in the cool, constant temperature of the deep earth, protected from the scouring sands and the biting winds of the millennia. As the years passed, more surveys were conducted, each adding a new layer to the map of the invisible. In the mid-1990s, further explorations using electromagnetic sounders suggested that there might be a tunnel system connecting these chambers, a labyrinthine network that weaves beneath the entire Giza Plateau. One particular anomaly, located under the left paw, has drawn the most attention. It is a large, room-like space that appears to have been carved with flat walls and a level ceiling. The data suggests it is not filled with debris, but remains an open pocket of air, a bubble of the past trapped in the stone. One can almost imagine the air inside that chamber, heavy, still, and smelling of ancient dust and the cold scent of limestone that hasn't felt the sun in 10,000 years. The mystery of these subterranean echoes forces us to confront the limits of what we know. We see the Sphinx as a singular object, a monument to be photographed and measured, but perhaps it is merely the tip of an iceberg of history. If the chambers are real, and if they contain the artifacts of a pre-Egyptian culture, it would rewrite every page of our origins. It would mean that the cradle of civilization was not a slow awakening in the Fertile Crescent, but a reawakening, a recovery from a lost height. The seismic pulses that bounce off those hidden walls are like a heartbeat, slow and rhythmic, reminding us that we are walking on top of a story that hasn't been read in an eternity. There is a certain beauty in the resistance of the earth to give up these secrets. Despite our most advanced tools, the stone remains a formidable barrier. The Egyptian authorities and the international scientific community move with extreme caution, aware that any attempt to enter these voids could compromise the integrity of the Sphinx itself. And so, we remain in a state of suspended anticipation. We have the maps, we have the echoes, and we have the coordinates of the unknown, yet the threshold remains uncrossed. It is a reminder that some things are meant to be discovered only when we have the wisdom to handle what we find. The Sphinx sits in its quiet vigil, guarding not just the horizon, but the very ground it rests upon, keeping the echoes of the Hall of Records safe from the clamour of the modern world. As we contemplate these hidden spaces, the mind begins to wander through the dark corridors of what might be. We imagine shelves of stone tablets, or perhaps metallic discs, etched with the movements of the stars from a time when the North Star was not Polaris, but Thuban. We imagine the tools of a lost science, or the simple, haunting remains of a people who saw the world end and tried to leave a message for those who would eventually crawl back into the light. The seismic surveys provide the skeleton of this mystery, but our imagination provides the soul. The voids are there, undeniable and silent, waiting for the moment when the cycle of time allows the doors to finally open. And so, the search continues in the quiet hours of the Egyptian night, when the tourists have gone and the plateau is left to the stars and the wind. The researchers look at their screens, tracing the outlines of chambers that should not exist according to the history books we were taught in school. They feel the weight of deep time pressing down, the sheer scale of the thousands of years that separate us from the builders. The Sphinx remains the great silent witness, its gaze fixed on the rising sun, while beneath its massive weight, the echoes of a lost civilization continue to vibrate in the dark, waiting for someone to finally understand the language of the silence. Imagine a single weathered chisel mark hidden in the shadow of a massive limestone fold, where the stone seems to remember the strike of a hammer from 4,500 years ago. This is where the story we are told usually begins, in the dust and heat of the Fourth Dynasty, under the reign of the Pharaoh Khafra. The conventional narrative, whispered by scholars and etched into the guidebooks of the modern world, suggests that this king looked upon the rocky outcrop of the Giza Plateau and saw not just a hill, but a guardian. In this version of history, it was Khafra who commanded his stonemasons to shape the living rock into his own likeness, merging the strength of a lion with the divine intellect of a pharaoh. We are told that the Sphinx is his monument, a testament to the absolute power of the old kingdom, rising from the sand as a sentinel for his nearby pyramid. And yet, as we linger in the silence of the enclosure, a different possibility begins to take shape, a sense that Khafra may not have been the creator of the Sphinx, but rather its most devoted restorer. As the years passed, the pharaoh's architects began the monumental task of constructing the Sphinx temple, which sits directly in front of the great guardian. To build this structure, they did not bring stone from distant quarries in the south. Instead, they took the very blocks they had excavated from the ditch surrounding the Sphinx. These are not the small, manageable bricks of later eras, but gargantuan megaliths, some weighing more than 200 tons. It is a staggering thought to consider the logistics of such a feat. The rhythmic chanting of hundreds of men, the straining of cedar rollers, the scent of sweat and ancient dust as these massive limestone hearts were moved into place. When you look closely at these blocks today, you see a strange and telling detail. The geology of the temple stones matches the layers of the Sphinx perfectly, confirming they were pulled from the same bedrock. However, the temple blocks show the same heavy, undulating erosion as the Sphinx itself, a deep, vertical scarring that speaks of ancient rains. If the temple was built at the same time the Sphinx was carved, and if that time was truly the dry era of the Fourth Dynasty, how did these massive blocks become so deeply weathered so quickly? It is here that the idea of an inheritance begins to feel more like a reality than a theory. Perhaps Khafra arrived at Giza to find a monument already ancient, already crumbling under the weight of thousands of years of exposure to the elements. Instead of claiming credit for something new, he may have been performing an act of sacred archaeology, clearing away the encroaching sands that have always sought to swallow the Sphinx whole. We see evidence of this in the very stones of the monument's body. There are layers of masonry, large limestone blocks applied to the exterior of the Sphinx to protect its soft, weathered core. For decades, it was assumed these were modern repairs, or perhaps the work of the Romans. But careful analysis of the stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and their chronological order, reveals that some of these repairs date back to the Old Kingdom itself. Think of the implications of such a discovery. If the Egyptians of the Fourth Dynasty were already repairing the Sphinx, it means the statue was already old in their eyes. It means that even 4,500 years ago, the figure was showing signs of extreme age and decay. The pharaohs were masters of stone, yet here they were, acting as conservators for a relic of a time they perhaps only dimly remembered through myth and oral tradition. They used massive blocks to casing the paws and the lower body, trying to halt the inevitable shedding of the limestone. This work suggests a deep reverence, a desire to preserve a legacy that they believed was vital to the spiritual health of Egypt. They were not just building a tomb, they were tending to a god that had survived from the first time, the Zep Tepi, the legendary golden age that preceded the rise of the dynastic kings. Meanwhile, the mystery of the face continues to haunt the edges of our understanding. If you look at the Sphinx from the side, you might notice that the head is significantly smaller in proportion to the rest of the body. In the world of classical sculpture, such a disproportion is rare, especially for a civilization that prized mathematical harmony as much as the Egyptians did. This has led many to wonder if the head we see today is not the original. Perhaps, in the deep reaches of time, the Sphinx bore the head of a great lion, standing tall and proud above the plateau. But as the millennia wore on and the soft limestone of the face eroded into an unrecognizable shape, a later pharaoh, perhaps Khafra, or perhaps someone even earlier, sought to reclaim the monument. They may have carved the existing, smaller head out of the weathered remains of the original, larger one. This would explain why the head is less eroded than the body. It is made of the same stone, yet it looks centuries younger. It is a second skin, a new mask placed upon an ancient soul. As we stand in the shadow of the Sphinx, the wind carries the faint scent of dry earth and the distant muffled sounds of the modern world. But here, time seems to stretch and thin. We are looking at a palimpsest, a manuscript that has been written over, erased, and written over again. The Fourth Dynasty was merely one chapter in a much longer book. The repair work they conducted tells us that they were aware of the fragility of the stone, and perhaps they were aware of the fragility of their own place in history. They saw themselves as the bridge between the gods of the past and the humanity of the future. By casing the Sphinx in new stone, they were tying their own destiny to the eternal presence of the Watcher. The sheer scale of the limestone blocks in the Sphinx temple continues to defy easy explanation. To move a 200-ton block is a feat that would challenge modern engineers with hydraulic cranes, yet the builders of the Fourth Dynasty did it with ropes, levers, and an intimate understanding of gravity. But if they were simply building a temple for a new statue, why use such impossibly large stones? Some suggest that the size of the blocks was intended to mirror the antiquity of the Sphinx itself, that the builders were trying to match the language of an earlier, more megalithic civilization. It is as if they were trying to speak to the original builders in their own tongue, using the weight of the earth to anchor themselves to a lost era of giants. As the light fades over the plateau, casting long blue shadows across the enclosure floor, we are left to contemplate the layers of effort that have gone into keeping this monument alive. From the first unknown hands that shaped the bedrock, to the masons of Khafra who patched the crumbling walls, to the modern archaeologists who brush away the dust of centuries, the Sphinx has always been a work in progress. It is a mirror reflecting the ambitions of every civilization that has stood before it. The Fourth Dynasty did not just inherit a statue, they inherited a responsibility. They became the guardians of the guardian, ensuring that the silent witness would continue to watch the horizon for another 5,000 years. And as we look upon those ancient repairs, we realize that we are just the latest in a long line of visitors, trying to piece together a story that was already half forgotten. When the pyramids were new, the stone remained silent, holding its secrets behind a mask of weathered limestone, while the echoes of the Fourth Dynasty fade into the deeper, older shadows of the Great Sphinx. The scent of damp earth and cooling limestone often lingers in the hollows of the Giza Plateau long after the heat of the day has retreated, a subtle reminder that the desert is never truly dry, nor is it ever truly still. As the centuries drifted by like the very dunes that sought to reclaim the monument, the identity of the Great Sphinx began to shift in the minds of those who lived beneath its shadow. The memory of the old kingdom pharaohs, those distant architects who may have only been the latest in a line of restorers, started to blur into the realm of myth. By the time the new kingdom dawned, roughly 3,500 years ago, the statue was no longer viewed merely as a portrait of a king or a guardian of a tomb. It had become something more ethereal, more divine. The Egyptians began to call it Horemakhet, Horus of the horizon. To the people of this era, the Sphinx was a living manifestation of the sun god at the moment of its most potent transition. The precise heartbeat when the sun touches the line between the earth and the sky. It was the lord of the two horizons, representing the eternal cycle of rebirth and the triumph of light over the encroaching darkness of the underworld. The lion's body, rooted deep in the bedrock of the plateau, anchored the celestial spirit of Horus to the physical world, creating a bridge between the stars and the sand. This was a time of renewed wonder, where the ancient stone was treated with a reverence that bordered on the ecstatic. The pharaohs of the 18th dynasty looked upon the weathered face not as a relic of a dead ancestor, but as a vibrant, breathing deity that could grant legitimacy to their rule. Among these seekers of divine favor was a young prince named Thutmose. History tells us that he was not the intended heir to the throne, a man born into the shadow of his brothers, wandering the high desert on hunting expeditions to escape the pressures of the royal court. One afternoon, exhausted by the heat, Thutmose sought shelter in the only shade available on the plateau, the narrow patch of coolness cast by the head of the Sphinx, which at that time was buried up to its neck in the shifting sands of the Sahara. As he fell into a deep, heavy sleep, the prince experienced a vision that would alter the course of Egyptian history and provide us with one of the most significant archaeological artifacts ever discovered. In his dream, the Sphinx spoke to him. The great god Horemakhet addressed the prince as a father speaks to a son, complaining of the weight of the sand that pressed against his limbs and the neglect that had allowed his form to be swallowed by the desert. The deity made a celestial bargain. If Thutmose would clear the sand and restore the monument to its former glory, the Sphinx would ensure that he became the next pharaoh of Egypt. It is a story of divine intervention that feels almost like a fairy tale. Yet the evidence of this encounter stands today between the very paws of the statue. When Thutmose eventually ascended the throne as Thutmose IV, he fulfilled his promise with a grandiosity befitting a god. He commissioned a massive slab of pink granite, standing over 14 feet tall, known to us now as the Dream Stele. This monument was placed directly in front of the Sphinx's chest, a permanent testament to his devotion and the miraculous nature of his rise to power. The carvings on the stele depict the king offering incense and libations to the couchant lion, a scene that solidified the Sphinx's role as the supreme protector of the Giza necropolis. The clearing of the sands was a monumental undertaking, an act of archaeological devotion performed over 3,000 years ago. As the workers labored to remove the golden drifts, they were essentially excavating a mystery that was already ancient to them. One wonders what they thought as the massive paws were slowly revealed, or if they noticed the strange vertical water erosion patterns on the enclosure walls, marks that even then might have hinted at a history far older than the dynasties they served. For a brief window of time, the Sphinx stood clear, its limestone body painted in vibrant shades of red and blue, a colourful titan standing guard over a kingdom that was at the height of its imperial splendour. During this period, the religious significance of the Sphinx reached a fever pitch. It became a site of pilgrimage, a place where the common people and the elite alike would come to leave small votive offerings, tiny clay ears perhaps, so that the god might hear their prayers, or small steles of their own, seeking protection and long life. The area around the Sphinx was transformed into a sacred precinct, with small chapels and viewing platforms built to accommodate the faithful. It was no longer a silent, lonely sentinel. It was the beating heart of a solar cult that saw the entire Giza Plateau as a map of the heavens. Yet even as the New Kingdom priests performed their daily rituals and burned their sweet Kai-Fi incense, the true origin of the monument remained veiled. They called it Horemakhet. But did they know who had first struck the stone? Did they understand that the horizon Horus guarded might have been a celestial alignment from a time before the first pharaoh ever wore the double crown? The dream, stele itself, contains a curious detail. It mentions the splendid place of the first time, a phrase the Egyptians used to refer to Zep Tepi, the legendary golden age when the gods walked the earth. By linking the Sphinx to this primordial era, Thutmose IV was acknowledging that the statue belonged to a timeline that stretched back into the mists of prehistory, far beyond the reach of written records. As the centuries rolled on and the power of the new kingdom began to wane, the desert, patient and relentless, began its slow return. The chapels were eventually abandoned, the incense burners grew cold, and the golden sands began to climb the limestone flanks once more. The dream stele remained, partially obscured, a silent witness to a king's promise. But the Sphinx itself seemed indifferent to the ebb and flow of human devotion. Whether it was worshipped as a god or forgotten as a ruin, it continued to stare toward the east, waiting for the sun to rise over a horizon that had seen civilizations rise and fall like the tides of the Nile. We are left to ponder the weight of this religious transformation. Was the identification with Horemakhet a genuine discovery of the statue's original purpose, or was it a beautiful, pious reimagining of a relic whose true meaning had been lost in the depths of the Younger Dryas, that period of cataclysmic climate change thousands of years earlier? The Egyptians of the New Kingdom were masters of stone and spirit. Yet they, too, were looking backward, trying to find their place in a landscape that was already saturated with the ghosts of a forgotten past. The Sphinx, in its quiet majesty, allowed them to see what they needed to see: a god, a protector, a father. And as we stand before it today, we realize that we are doing much the same, projecting our own theories and longings onto a face that has seen the world change in ways we are only beginning to understand. The desert is not a static thing, but a slow golden ocean that moves in rhythms measured by centuries rather than seconds. As the old kingdom faded into the middle and the middle into the new, a quiet transformation began to overtake the Giza Plateau. The wind, relentless and patient, carried with it the fine, abrasive grains of the Sahara, whispering across the limestone and settling into every hollow and crevice. Slowly, the monumental body of the Sphinx began to disappear. It was as if the earth itself were reclaiming its own, pulling the stone lion back into the safety of the subterranean world from which it had been carved. Eventually, the colossal paws were submerged. Then the broad chest was swallowed by the rising tide of silt. For vast stretches of human history, the Sphinx was not the guardian we see today, but a lonely, disembodied head rising directly out of the dunes. To the eyes of the weary traveller or the local shepherd, it appeared as a giant emerging from the underworld, a stone mask watching the horizon with an expression of eternal patience. The sand acted as a shroud, a heavy, protective blanket that shielded the delicate details of the lower body from the harsh, scouring winds and the prying hands of those who might seek to dismantle it for building materials. While the great temples of Memphis were being stripped of their limestone casings to build the rising cities of the north, the Sphinx lay hidden, preserved in a tomb of its own making. As the centuries turned into millennia, the memory of what lay beneath the sand began to blur into myth. Medieval travellers from distant lands, arriving on the backs of camels or trekking on foot from the banks of the Nile, looked upon the face with a mixture of awe and profound confusion. To the Arab chroniclers of the Middle Ages, the Sphinx was known as Abu al-Hol, the father of terror, a name that suggests a lingering ancestral memory of its true power. They sat in its long shadow during the heat of the day, marvelling at the scale of the features. One such traveller, the physician and historian Abd al-Latif al-Baghdadi, writing in the early 13th century, described the face as having a reddish tint, the lips possessing a certain grace and beauty, as if the stone were on the verge of speech. He marvelled at the mathematical precision of the features, noting that even in its colossal scale the proportions of the face remained perfectly harmonious. It is during this long sandy slumber that the mystery of the missing nose takes root in the popular imagination. While a common legend suggests that the nose was shot off by the cannons of Napoleon Bonaparte's soldiers during the French campaign in Egypt, sketches made by the Danish explorer Frederick Louis Norden in 1737 clearly show the Sphinx already lacking its nose, decades before Napoleon was even born. Earlier accounts from the 14th century suggest a different story, one of religious fervor and a desire to blind the idol that the local farmers still made offerings to in hopes of a bountiful harvest. A Sufi fanatic named Mohammed Sa'im al-Dahar is said to have defaced the monument out of a sense of pious duty, an act of iconoclasm that sought to break the spell the ancient face still cast over the people. Yet, despite the missing nose and the scars of time, the Sphinx remained an object of obsession. The sand was a paradox. It was an enemy to visibility, hiding the grand design of the enclosure and the magnificent paws that stretched forward into the sun. But it was also a savior. Because the body was buried for thousands of years, the deep erosion patterns on the lower sections were kept in a state of suspended animation. The delicate limestone, which would have surely crumbled into dust if exposed to the elements for the entirety of its existence, remained relatively intact. When archaeologists finally began the Herculean task of clearing the sand in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found a time capsule. They discovered that the Sphinx was not just a statue, but part of a complex architectural landscape, with temples and altars that had been invisible to the medieval world. Imagine the silence of those long centuries, when the only sound was the whistling of the wind through the hollows of the ears and the occasional cry of a hawk circling above. The Sphinx watched the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, the spread of new religions, and the birth of modern science, all while remaining neck-deep in the desert floor. It became a landmark for the lost, a fixed point in a shifting sea of dunes. The people who lived in its shadow during these Middle Ages did not see a relic of a lost civilization or a subject for geological debate. They saw a living presence, a spirit of the place that demanded respect. They told stories of how the Sphinx spoke in dreams, or how it guarded hidden chambers filled with the wisdom of the first gods. As the years passed, the weight of the sand grew heavier, pressing against the limestone flanks. This pressure, combined with the occasional moisture from rare desert rains, may have played its own role in the chemical changes of the stone, further complicating the efforts of modern scientists to date the monument through surface analysis alone. We must wonder what was lost during this time and what was saved. If the Sphinx had remained fully exposed to the sun and wind since the time of the pyramids, or even earlier, would there be anything left for us to study? Or did the desert, in its infinite wisdom, decide to hide the Sphinx away until a time when we might be ready to understand its secrets? Meanwhile, the head, ever exposed, bore the brunt of the world's gaze. It became the symbol of Egypt itself, an icon of the eternal. Even as the great pyramids were stripped of their gleaming white casings, leaving them jagged and grey, the Sphinx face remained a testament to the skill of those unknown hands that first shaped it. It is a face that has been weathered by the very air of history, its features softened by time until it seems less like a sculpture and more like a natural formation that just happened to take the shape of a human consciousness. The transition from the medieval view to the modern archaeological view was not a sudden one. It was a slow awakening, much like the process of unburying the monument itself. When the first modern excavators, like Giovanni Battista Caviglia in 1817, began to dig, they were shocked by the scale of what lay beneath. They expected to find a pedestal. Instead, they found a lion. They found the dream stele of Thutmose IV, a massive slab of granite nestled between the paws, telling a story of a prince who fell asleep in the shadow of the head and was promised the crown of Egypt if he would only clear away the choking sands. This cycle of burial and excavation seems to be a fundamental part of the Sphinx's life. It is a creature of the earth that periodically retreats into the ground, only to be resurrected by those who are drawn to its mystery. Each time it is uncovered, it reveals something new, yet it always keeps its most profound secrets tucked away, just out of reach. We look at the body now with its strange undulating waves of erosion that suggest the flow of ancient water, and we realize that the sand did not just preserve the stone, it preserved a question. It kept the evidence of a much older world safe from the ravages of the new, waiting for a generation that would look at the stone not just as a monument to a king, but as a map of a forgotten epoch. The Long Slumber was a period of quiet incubation. While the world above changed beyond recognition, the Sphinx remained in a state of perfect stillness. It was a bridge between the deep time of the past and the frantic pace of the future, and as the last of the sand was finally carted away in the early 20th century, the world was forced to confront the sheer physical reality of this giant. No longer just a head in the sand, it stood revealed in all its confusing, magnificent glory. A lion with the head of a man, carved from a single ridge of stone, carrying the scars of a history that did not fit the books we had written. The protective shroud was gone, and the Sphinx was once again exposed to the light of day, inviting us to look closer, to look deeper, and to wonder once more what truly happened in that valley before the first Pharaoh ever wore the crown. The weight of 1,000 years is heavy, but the weight of 12,000 is a burden that the modern mind struggles to carry. As the sands were cleared away, and the full magnitude of the Sphinx was revealed to the modern world, a quiet tension began to grow within the halls of academia, a friction between the visible scars on the stone and the written records in the archives. To walk the perimeter of the Sphinx enclosure today is to walk through a battlefield of ideas, where the weapons are not swords or spears, but laser scanners, geological hammers, and the slow, methodical application of the scientific method. On one side of this invisible line stand the traditional Egyptologists, the keepers of the dynastic story, who maintain that the Sphinx is the work of the pharaoh Khafra, carved roughly 4,500 years ago. Their evidence is rooted in the context of the plateau, the nearby temples, the causeways, and the proximity of the Great Pyramids. To them, the Sphinx is a piece of a larger puzzle, a cog in the machinery of the old kingdom. But on the other side, a new generation of geological revisionists looks not at the cultural context, but at the skin of the earth itself. They see the deep, rolling fissures in the limestone, the vertical channels carved by cascading water, and they hear a different story. A story of a time when the Sahara was not a desert, but a lush, rain-swept savanna. This clash is not merely a disagreement over a date on a calendar. It is a fundamental shift in how we perceive the timeline of human capability. If the geologists are correct, and the primary weathering on the Sphinx was caused by thousands of years of heavy rainfall, then the monument must have been standing long before the first pharaoh ever unified the Nile Valley. It would mean the Sphinx is a relic of the younger Dryas, a period of chaotic climate shifts and cataclysmic floods that occurred over 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. The debate has become a quest for a consensus that seems to drift further away with every new discovery, as both sides reach into the deep past to find a truth that the stone refuses to yield easily. One of the greatest hurdles in this ongoing debate is the inherent difficulty of dating the stone itself. In the world of archaeology, the gold standard has long been radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon isotopes in organic material to determine its age. It is a brilliant tool for dating bone, wood, or charcoal, but it is utterly silent when it comes to solid rock. You cannot carbon date a mountain, and you cannot carbon date the carving of a statue. We can date the mortar used in later repairs, or the remains of a workman's lunch found in the debris, but the moment the first chisel struck, the limestone remains shielded by time. As the years passed, researchers began to turn toward more exotic methods, such as chlorine-36 dating, which attempts to measure how long a rock surface has been exposed to cosmic rays from space. Others look toward the science of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers, to see how the enclosure walls have eroded over the millennia. Yet, even these advanced techniques are fraught with complexity. The Sphinx has been buried and unburied so many times, scrubbed by wind-blown sand and patched by the hands of countless kings, that its geological signature is a chaotic map of overlapping eras. It is a palimpsest, a parchment that has been erased and written over so many times that the original message is nearly lost to the eye. The traditionalists argue that the geological evidence is being misread, suggesting that the salt in the limestone or the moisture in the night air could have caused the deep erosion patterns over a shorter period. They point to the lack of other large-scale ruins from the 10,000-year mark as proof that no civilization existed back then capable of such a feat. Meanwhile, the revisionists argue that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. They suggest that perhaps the Sphinx was not a product of a settled city, but the work of a forgotten maritime culture, or a group of survivors from a lost epoch who left their mark in the only medium that could survive the end of an age, the living bedrock. In the quiet of the Egyptian night, when the tourists have departed and the plateau is left to the stars, the Sphinx seems to exist in a space between these two worlds. It does not care for our labels or our chronologies. It simply is. The quest for consensus continues, driven by a deep-seated human need to order the chaos of the past, to place every event in a neat, linear progression. But the Sphinx suggests that history may be more circular, or perhaps more fragmented than we are comfortable admitting. It hints at a deep time that stretches back into the mists of prehistory, a time when the stars in the sky were in a different alignment, and the world was a very different place. As we look closer at the weathering, we see that the head of the Sphinx is remarkably well preserved compared to its weathered body. This has led many to wonder if the head we see today is not the original head at all, but a later recarving, a pharaoh's face chiseled out of a much older, much larger lion's head that had already been worn down by the elements. This theory would explain the strange proportions of the monument, the way the head seems slightly too small for the massive leonine torso. It suggests a lineage of guardianship, where one civilization inherits the ruins of another, honoring the ancient stone by giving it a new face, a new name, and a new purpose. And so, the modern debate remains a living thing, breathing new life into the silent stone. Every few years, a new study is published, a new set of measurements is taken, and the pendulum of opinion swings once more. We find ourselves in a state of perpetual wonder, caught between the rigorous demands of hard science and the intuitive pull of a mystery that feels far older than our history books allow. The Sphinx stands as a sentinel at the edge of our understanding, a guardian not just of the Giza Plateau, but of the secrets of our own origins. It reminds us that for all our satellites and sensors, there are still parts of our story that remain hidden beneath the sand, waiting for a time when we are ready to truly see them. The more we learn, the more we realize how little we actually know. The Great Sphinx is a mirror, reflecting back to us our own theories, our own biases, and our own longing for a connection to the deep past. Whether it was carved by the command of a pharaoh, or by the hands of a forgotten people who watched the rains fall on a green Sahara, its presence is a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit to leave a mark upon the world. As the debate continues, the Sphinx remains unmoved, a silent witness to the rise and fall of empires, the shifting of climates, and the endless curiosity of the human mind. It waits patiently for the day when the consensus finally aligns with the truth, or perhaps it simply waits for the desert to reclaim it once more, returning its secrets to the earth from which it was born. To understand the Sphinx is to view it not as a single statue carved at a single moment in time, but as a palimpsest, a parchment that has been written upon, erased and rewritten by a dozen different hands across the vast stretches of human history. When we look upon its weathered flanks and its strangely small, regal head, we are not looking at a finished product, but at a living document of the earth itself. It is a synthesis of three distinct worlds: the raw geology of the African plate, the prehistoric vision of a forgotten culture, and the refined artistry of the dynastic Egyptians who sought to claim it as their own. Long before the first pharaoh wore the double crown, the limestone of the Giza Plateau was already a masterpiece of deep time. Millions of years ago, this land was the floor of a shallow sea, where the shells of tiny marine creatures settled in thick layers, eventually hardening into the rock we see today. The Sphinx was born from this ancient sediment, waiting in the bedrock for someone to recognize its potential. As the winds shifted and the rains of the early Holocene began to fall, the natural forces of erosion likely began the work that humans would later finish. Perhaps a protruding knob of harder rock suggested the shape of a head, or a long horizontal ridge evoked the resting body of a great beast. In those misty, distant millennia, the line between what nature created and what humans imagined was thin and porous. As the years passed, the first carvers arrived. These were people whose names have been lost to the winds, cultures that existed long before the invention of writing or the building of the first mud brick mastabas. They saw the potential in the stone and began to shape it, perhaps using the very rains that weathered the rock to help them hollow out the enclosure. This was the era of the prehistoric carving, a time when the Sphinx may have possessed the head of a lion or perhaps a jackal, proportional to its massive body and staring out at a horizon that was green and lush with vegetation. This was not the dry, golden desert we know today, but a savanna teeming with life, where the roar of actual lions echoed across the plains. The Sphinx was their guardian, a silent sentinel marking the passage of the sun and the stars during an age that mainstream archaeology is only just beginning to acknowledge. Then came the transition, the slow drying of the world. As the rains failed and the Sahara began its long, relentless march across the continent, the great monument was slowly buried by the drifting sands. For centuries, perhaps even millennia, only the head would have been visible, a strange, weathered outcropping of rock rising from the dunes. By the time the Fourth Dynasty of Egypt rose to power, the Sphinx was already an ancient mystery, a relic of a time so distant it had passed into the realm of myth. The dynastic Egyptians did not see a ruin, however. They saw a sacred opportunity. They excavated the body, clearing away the sand with a devotion that suggests they recognized the monument's profound significance. They smoothed the weathered surfaces, added layers of protective masonry, and recarved the head into the likeness of a king, creating the iconic image that has defined our understanding of the monument for the last 4,000 years. This process of refinement was an act of cultural inheritance. The pharaohs were not just builders. They were stewards of a legacy they barely understood. By placing their own features upon the ancient stone, they were tethering their young civilization to the deep, primordial power of the earth. The Sphinx became a bridge between the finite life of a king and the infinite reach of geological time. It is this layering of eras, the natural rock, the prehistoric monument, and the dynastic restoration, that gives the Sphinx its peculiar, haunting energy. It is a monument that refuses to be categorized, a structure that exists in multiple timelines simultaneously. When we consider the Sphinx as a palimpsest, the contradictions that have long puzzled researchers begin to dissolve. The water erosion on the body belongs to the prehistoric rains of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climatic change nearly 12,000 years ago. The crisp geometric lines of the face belong to the Old Kingdom, The repair blocks and the stela between the paws belong to the New Kingdom and the Roman era. Each layer is a testament to human curiosity and the desire to find meaning in the landscape. We are drawn to the Sphinx because it represents the ultimate mystery of our own origins, a physical reminder that there are chapters of the human story that have been torn out and scattered to the winds. The enduring power of the Sphinx lies in its ability to remain silent while we project our own histories upon it. It has been a sun god, a guardian of the underworld, a symbol of royal power, and a target for the curiosity of modern science. It has watched as the stars of Orion shifted their positions in the sky, and as the Nile changed its course across the valley. Through it all, it has remained unmoved, a silent witness to the rise and fall of empires that thought they would last forever. It reminds us that our current understanding of history is merely a snapshot, a single frame in a film that has been playing for tens of thousands of years. As we look at the Sphinx today, we are seeing the result of an incredible collaboration between the forces of nature and the ingenuity of the human spirit. It is a synthesis of the terrestrial and the celestial, the ancient and the modern. It stands as a symbol of our collective memory, a placeholder for the things we have forgotten, but are desperate to remember. The questions it poses are not just about dates and dynasties, but about the very nature of time itself. How much of our history has been lost to the sand? How many civilizations have flourished and faded before the first pyramid was ever conceived? The Sphinx does not offer easy answers. It simply exists, a massive stone question mark etched into the edge of the desert. In the quiet of the night, when the tourists have gone and the lights of Cairo flicker in the distance, the Sphinx seems to regain its original stature. The shadows stretch long across the enclosure, hiding the scars of modern restoration and the wear of the centuries. In that stillness, it is easy to imagine the monument as it once was. A vibrant, painted titan standing amidst a green valley, its eyes fixed on the exact point where the sun would rise on the spring equinox. It was a machine for tracking time, a temple of the stars, and a mirror of the human soul. The mystery of what really carved the face, or what the face truly was before it became a pharaoh, may never be solved to everyone's satisfaction. Stratigraphy and radiocarbon dating can provide us with windows into the past, but they cannot capture the spirit of the people who first laid hands upon the stone. They cannot tell us why they felt compelled to create something so vast, or what they felt as they watched the first rains wash over their work. But perhaps the lack of a definitive answer is what keeps the Sphinx alive in our imagination. It forces us to keep searching, to keep questioning the narratives we have been handed, and to look more closely at the world around us. As we drift toward the conclusion of our journey through the sands of Giza, the weight of these forgotten ages feels heavy, yet strangely comforting. We are part of a long line of seekers who have stood before the Sphinx and wondered at its purpose. We are part of the same curiosity that drove the prehistoric carvers and the dynastic architects. The Sphinx is a reminder that even if our names are forgotten and our cities crumble into dust, the marks we leave upon the world can endure for eons, waiting for someone in a distant future to find them and wonder who we were. It is a monument to the persistence of the human dream, carved into the very bones of the earth, waiting patiently for the next chapter of its story to be written. The desert does not keep time in seconds or minutes, but in the slow, rhythmic pulse of the stars as they wheel overhead, tracing the same ancient paths they followed when the limestone of the Giza Plateau was still a seabed of prehistoric shells. To stand before the Great Sphinx in the deep stillness of the night is to feel the weight of these countless cycles, a sensation that the modern world is merely a thin layer of dust resting upon a foundation of staggering antiquity. As the heat of the day radiates back into the cold air, A profound silence settles over the sands, and the Great Sphinx remains as it has always been. A silent watchman, staring toward the eastern horizon with an expression that seems to look through the present and into a past that remains just out of our reach. There is a particular kind of peace found in the shadow of this monument, a realization that some secrets are perhaps meant to be kept by the earth itself. We have measured the erosion upon its flanks, calculated the alignment of its gaze with the constellations of 10,000 years ago, and peered into the hollows beneath its paws with the most advanced technology our age can provide. Yet, for every answer we uncover, the Sphinx seems to pose a new riddle, one that transcends the simple questions of who carved it, or when the first chisel struck the stone. It stands as a bridge between the known and the unknown, a physical manifestation of the boundary, where history dissolves into myth. As the cool night wind whispers across the weathered ridges of its back, one can almost imagine the Giza Plateau as it might have looked long before the first pharaohs claimed it as their own. In that distant epoch, perhaps the rains fell more frequently, turning the surrounding landscape into a lush savanna, where the ancestors of the Egyptians moved in harmony with the seasons. In this vision of the deep past, the Sphinx was not a ruin to be restored, but a fresh creation, a bold statement of human presence in a world that was still wild and untamed. The water that flowed over its enclosure did not represent decay, but life, carving the very channels that we now study with such intense curiosity. The mystery of the face, so much smaller than the body it rests upon, continues to haunt the imagination. Whether it was reshaped by a king seeking immortality, or weathered by the relentless hands of time and sand, it serves as a metaphor for the human condition itself. We are constantly rebuilding upon the ruins of what came before, reshaping the legacy of our ancestors to fit the needs of our own era. The Sphinx has seen empires rise from the dust and return to it, watched as languages were born and forgotten, and remained steadfast while the very climate of the planet shifted around it. It is a testament to the idea that even the most solid stone is fluid when viewed through the lens of deep time. And so, the plateau returns to the darkness, the tourists and the archaeologists having retreated to the lights of the modern city, leaving the monument to its eternal vigil. The moonlight catches the pale limestone, casting long, soft shadows that smooth over the scars of the centuries, making the Sphinx look, for a moment, as whole and powerful as it must have appeared in the dawn of its existence. In these quiet hours, the debates over stratigraphy and the younger Dryas seem to fade away, replaced by a simple, wordless appreciation for the sheer endurance of this stone titan. It does not need our permission to exist, nor does it require our understanding to maintain its dignity. Perhaps the ultimate truth of the Great Sphinx is that it was never meant to be fully understood by any single generation. It is a message in a bottle, cast into the ocean of time, intended to be found again and again by different cultures, each bringing their own questions and their own dreams to its feet. To the ancient Egyptians, it was Horemakhet, the sun god at the horizon. To the Greeks, it was a creature of riddles. To us, it is a puzzle of geology and forgotten civilizations. And to those who will come thousands of years after we are gone, it will likely be something else entirely, a relic of a past that they, too, will struggle to comprehend. The desert night is vast and generous, reclaiming the plateau with a gentle touch. The stars continue their slow crawl across the velvet sky, reflecting in the invisible eyes of the monument. There is a comfort in this continuity, a sense that we are part of a story that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we have departed. The Sphinx is the anchor for that story, a physical point of contact with the infinite. As the world sleeps, the stone remains, breathing with the rhythm of the ages, waiting with a patience that only the earth can truly know. As the darkness deepens and the air grows still, the mysteries of the Giza Plateau feel less like problems to be solved and more like companions to be lived with. We may never know for certain who first looked upon that natural outcropping of rock and saw a guardian waiting to be released. We may never fully grasp the purpose of the chambers that lie hidden in the bedrock, or the exact nature of the cataclysms that once reshaped this land. But in the presence of the Sphinx, the need for absolute certainty begins to slip away, replaced by a quiet wonder at the sheer scale of human history. The Great Sphinx is a reminder that we are never truly alone in time. We are surrounded by the echoes of those who came before us, people who looked at the same stars and felt the same sense of awe at the mystery of existence. Their hands touched these stones, their feet trod this sand, and their spirits are woven into the very fabric of the monument. In the stillness of the desert night, that connection feels tangible, a thread of shared experience that stretches back through the millennia, unbroken and resilient. The shadows lengthen and the constellations shift, marking the passage of another hour in a life that has spanned thousands of years. The Sphinx does not blink, it does not waver, it simply is, and in its being it offers us a profound gift, the realization that even in a world of constant change there are things that endure. There are monuments to the human soul that can withstand the wind, the rain, and the shifting sands of time itself. As the night nears its end and the first hints of a distant dawn begin to soften the eastern sky, the plateau remains a place of profound sanctuary. The Great Sphinx, the eternal watchman, continues its wait, its gaze fixed on the horizon, ready to greet another day, another century, another age. The mysteries it guards are safe within its stone heart, protected by the silence of the desert and the depth of the years. And as we drift into our own reflections, we can find peace in the knowledge that some things are meant to remain hidden, tucked away in the folds of history, waiting for the world to be ready to hear their story once more. The desert is quiet now, the only sound the faint trickle of sand moving in the breeze. The Sphinx remains, a shadow against the stars, a monument to the persistence of the dream, and a silent witness to the beauty of the unknown. In the heart of the plateau, under the watchful eye of the oldest guardian on earth, the passage of time is not a march, but a drift, a slow, peaceful journey into the deep, dark reaches of the past, where all questions eventually find their rest.